It's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker and presentation. He is Dr. Earl Schoerman. He graduated from Harvard College and the University of Michigan Medical School and practiced emergency medicine in the state of Oregon for more than 30 years, where he has been a longtime patron of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. After retiring from medicine in 2003, Earl enrolled at Southern Oregon University to study Shakespeare, and he began his research in the authorship question. Over more than a decade now, Earl has presented a series of papers at conferences for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and other prestigious organizations. He's been published on the topic of Shakespeare's Greek dramatic sources and also his remarkable medical acumen. Who better to tell you about what an expert Shakespeare was in medicine than an actual doctor? Earl contributed the chapter in Shakespeare's medical knowledge in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, ? Exposing an industry in denial, as well as several topics in Know-It-All Shakespeare. And if you don't have a copy of that, you can find it on Amazon. He is an associate of the Shakespearean Authorship Trust of London and a past president of the Shakespeare Fellowship. And today he's going to present to you Shakespeare and Politics, 16th to 21st Centuries. My pleasure to welcome to you, Dr. Earl Schoerman, MD.
Thank you very much again, Stephen. Well, it's a political season, isn't it? Presidential campaigns are going on and other elections. So I thought it would be a good topic for us to share today a little bit about how politicians have responded to Shakespeare and how Shakespeare wrote about politicians. It's a two-way street. I think it's actually quite a fascinating subject and worthy of our investigation. Now, there are some books I would recommend that are part of this analysis that I want to share with you. The first one is written by Stephen, no, this is from James Shapiro, excuse me. Shakespeare in a Divided America, What His Plays Tell Us About Our Past and Our Future. It's quite an interesting volume. He takes different periods of time, including a long chapter on John Quincy Adams and Quincy Adams' relationship with Shakespeare. He covers the Astor Place riots in New York in 1849. There was a production of Macbeth that was starring William McCready, the famous English actor, and Edwin Forrest, the famous American actor who had a bone to pick with McCready, was responsible in some way for fomenting a demonstration. Between 10 and 25,000 people were outside the Astor Place rioting during that production of Macbeth. And the people who were involved in controlling it, the New York militia, came out and began firing into the crowd. 20 people were killed and 100 wounded in that Shakespeare-related riot. That's one of the topics that he covers in here. And he covers, among other things, Oscar Eustis's public theater production of Julius Caesar, which we'll be talking more about as time goes on. The other book I want to share with you also is Stephen Greenblatt's book. Okay, two of the most popular Shakespeare authors have published books in the last few years. Shapiro's book was 2020, this year, and Tyrant, Shakespeare and Politics with Stephen Greenblatt was published in 2018 in the wake of the election of our 45th president. How Shakespeare Put Politics on the Stage, Power and Succession in the History Plays, a 500-page tome by Peter Lake. We'll be talking a little bit about Lake's observations also during this. Previous authors include John Palmer on political Shakespeare characters, it's the comic and tragic characters and political characters in Shakespeare, and David Bevington's book on Tudor drama and politics. So those are two very, very good books also written on this subject. So I want to get started on this presentation here by quoting Palmer's political and comic characters in Shakespeare. And he says it's a strange paradox that Shakespeare, who above all other dramatists was preoccupied with the private mind and heart of the individual, should have written a group of plays unmatched in any literature for their political content. And this was back in 1945, he's writing this. Jan Kott, the very, very highly renowned Polish Shakespeare specialist in Shakespeare Our Contemporary, has this to say, and it's a very, very interesting comment. Once a language had its fully adequate version of Shakespeare, it became able to support the foundations of a nation, its institutions, its political autonomy. Only the Bible rivals Shakespeare in this aspect of archetypal significance. Now, Wally Hirsch has been doing some work on the German response to Shakespeare that suggests that, in fact, the organization of the German nation had something to do with the dissemination of Shakespeare throughout throughout Germany during that time. And even during World War II, the German students were studying Shakespeare very, very seriously. So that's an interesting idea that Shakespeare's language itself provides the linguistic foundation for a culture. Now I want to talk a little bit about what is available to you online today. In the White House, Shakespeare and the US presidents is a wonderful website that talks about the presidents who were profoundly influenced by Shakespeare. And among them were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Abraham Lincoln. I just have a few comments about each of them because this comes right off of that website. It's a wonderful place to look and see how our early presidents in the first 100 years of our nation were profoundly influenced by Shakespeare. What Adams had to say, and he and Jefferson actually made a pilgrimage to Stratford-upon-Avon 20 years after the Jubilee of David Garrett. Yet there wasn't much going on over there that interested them. Jefferson didn't have anything to say other than he logged in how much it cost them to go to the Birthplace Trust and Holy Trinity Church and the other sites that were designated historical sites. Adams, on the other hand, had quite a bit to say. Adams says this about Shakespeare, that he was the great teacher of morality and politics, the great master of every affection of the heart and every sentiment of the mind, as well as all the powers of expression. But when he got to Stratford, he expressed grave disappointment of what he found there. There is nothing preserved of this great genius which is worth knowing, nothing which might inform us what education, what company, what accident turned his mind to letters and drama. His name is not even on his tombstone. And in a recent scan of that tomb in the floor of Holy Trinity Church suggested there even wasn't a skull in that tomb. So, you know, it's a bit of a mystery. Where did Shakespeare's head go? We don't know. John Quincy Adams was among America's foremost abolitionists, and he defended the Amistad slaves who had, mutinied and sailed their boat right into Plymouth and into Boston Harbor, and he defended them all the way to the Supreme Court. So he was a profoundly concerned citizen who was very deeply affected by Shakespeare, loved Hamlet, among other of the tragedies, but he had no patience for Othello or for Lear. He said that Lear was a dotard. He didn't think that Lear was a very good play at all, but he was particularly upset about Othello. And this is what he has to say in several articles he wrote about this during his lifetime. He says this about Desdemona. Who can sympathize with Desdemona, the daughter of a Venetian nobleman who falls in love and makes a runaway match with a blackamoor for no better reason than that he told her a braggart story of his hairbreadth escapes in war? For this, she not only violates the duties to her father, her family, her sex, and her country, the great moral lesson of Othello was that black and white blood cannot be intermingled in marriage without a gross outrage upon the law of nature. So he was okay about abolition. He was okay about human rights. But he was not okay about miscegenation. He was opposed to that. So that shows you that in his time, as strong a person as he was and as moral a person as he was, he did not see the races as being in a good situation to be mixed. So now Abraham Lincoln, he says he had 6 months of education in the school. So he was an autodidact. He loved Shakespeare. And where he learned Shakespeare was from a variety of sources. But when he got to Washington, the 4 years that he lived there in Washington, D.C., he went to over 100 performances of different plays. And he would often have the leading actors come to visit him in his box afterwards, or even come to the White House and have discourses. And he would love to spend the evenings reading Shakespeare to his visitors. His favorite play was Macbeth. There's a description of him in one of the plays that he had get during the Civil War. The plays gave him peace and respite from the stresses and strains of the Civil War presidency. Quote, it was during the production of Henry IV, part one. He has forgotten the war. He has forgotten Congress. He is out of politics. He is living in Prince Hal's time. So Lincoln was particularly influenced by Shakespeare and loved to quote him. Now, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, came from a Shakespeare family. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was a famous English Shakespeare actor who emigrated to America. And his older brother, Edwin Booth, was also a very famous Shakespeare actor, and they performed a number of Shakespeare productions. John Wilkes Booth saw himself as a Brutus. He actually identified himself in a notebook he wrote during the time that he was being pursued after the assassination. He thought that he was the Brutus who was taking down a tyrant, that Lincoln was a tyrant. And so from completely opposite standpoints. We have historical characters who were inspired by Shakespeare and taken completely different interpretations. And we're going to go forward because that continues in history. Now let's look at what's going on here in the 21st century today, in recent productions within the last 3 years. And I'm going to feature just a couple productions for you from very contemporary representations. This is an image from a production of a play, of a Shakespeare play, at the Guthrie Theater, directed by Rob Melrose. That was in 2012. Now, what Shakespeare play starts with some balls being held by one of the characters? You think of Henry V and the tennis balls that the French had sent him as an insult. But no, this is not tennis balls and Henry V. This is a production of the Tragedy of Julius Caesar. And in 2012, the character playing Caesar was an Obama-like character who knew how to handle a basketball, which was an identifier, of course, of our 44th president. And, of course, during the production, he does get assassinated, and he does lay out. Now, this is produced in Minneapolis at the world-famous Guthrie Theater. It went on national tour. It was produced on Broadway for at least 2 months, and there was no commentary, no critiquing of the fact that an Obama-like character was portrayed on the stage in a tragedy in which he is assassinated. The message, I think, of this play is that assassination, political assassination, is not a good thing. It results in civil war. It results in a greater tyranny in time. And that is perhaps the one thing that people understood when they saw this production. Fast forward 5 years to 2017, the year after the election of our current president, and you have Oscar Eustis's public theater production of The Tragedy of Julius Caesar at the Delacorte Theater in Central Park. Now, the public has produced Hair, Chorus Line, Hamilton. It's won more than 50 Tony Awards, world-class theater. And the Delacorte Theater seats about 2,300 people. The shows are free. And if you want to get a taste for what goes on in that theater, I highly recommend a video that's available on YouTube called Kiss Me Petruchio. And it shows the actors Meryl Streep and Raul Julia performing as Kate and Petruchio in a wonderful Joseph Papp production that features them in this. And you'll get a nice feeling for what that Delacorte Theater is like. But in any case, this is portrayed as a President Caesar. And there are all these emblems of the American political life on the stage there with our flag showing there, and a rather tyrannical looking portrayal of Caesar in this particular scene. There is even a line they inserted that he could have stabbed your mother on Fifth Avenue and you would still support him for his presidency. So they inserted some lines, and they had supernumerary actors in the audience who would respond by yelling and cheering and shouting and yelling during the production. They had about 40 actors actually in the theater itself acting out and responding to the actions on the stage. However, this scene in which the assassination occurs was a rather brutal scene. Now, they emphasized the violence in this particular production. It's a modern production. They had automatic weapons. They brought the conspirators out. They mowed them down. There was cannon fire in the distance, artillery, and it was done in a way that magnified the violence, particularly in this play. So the crowd was particularly, responsive to this. And there was a brief period of the assassination in which Caesar really fights back. He fought back like a boar, they said. So it was a particularly violent assassination. He didn't go down easily. Well, there was a 12-minute video clip that went viral that was seen by 500,000 people, and that resulted in millions of responses on social media that went crazy. The right-wing media, Breitbart News, some of the commentators on Fox and others were totally upset about this scene. And eventually, actors would come in, people who were hired would come in and rush the stage. Laura Loomer, who's now running for Congress in Florida, rushed the stage during one of the last productions and yelled out to the crowd, this is unseemly, you should be ashamed of yourself. I'm saving President Trump from being killed in Central Park. And that was the headline in Breitbart News, President Trump assassinated in Central Park, and the liberals are cheering for this, which was totally bananas. The outrage resulted in thousands of phone calls and letters and responses. Delta Airlines pulled out of the production of sponsorship. Bank of America pulled out. The National Endowment of the Arts had to issue a disclaimer. We had nothing to do with this particular production. The people were shocked by the overreaction to this production of Julius Caesar. It ran its course, but that was the outcome of another production. So you see the differences in responses just a few years apart, depending on the nature of the production and the emotional content of that scene. I'm sure it was quite shocking to Oscar Eustis, and there were a number of comments, and he just did not believe. Shakespeare Dallas received 40 threatening emails. All over the country, Shakespeare festivals were being attacked for what was going on in Delacorte Theater in Central Park. So I just want to let you know, Shakespeare can be very political even today. Now, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival has been known to do similar projects. This is a production in the Thomas Theater of the Tragedy of Julius Caesar. Clearly, with all these banners, as you go into the theater, suggested that this is put in the context of modern assassinations. You have the Kennedy brothers on the left up near the entry there, and you have Malcolm X and Martin Luther King across from them, and then other international political leaders, including Abraham Lincoln. That was the context they created to help the audience contextualize in a historical sense what the meaning of this particular play is. Another production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival of the Tragedy of Julius Caesar was particularly disturbing, and I attended this in 1982. I took my brother-in-law, who was a colonel in the Air Force at that time. What was brilliant about this play, was directed by Jerry Turner, is that it was done as a Latin coup. There were little posters that said Caesar around, and you used to see Che for Che Guevara, during the Cuban Revolution, that he was popular, and he was a doctor also, actually. So it was, the context was of a Latin revolution. You had that clearly in your mind when you saw the production. Right before intermission, right after the assassination of Caesar, he's laying there in a bloody mess on the stage. The conspirators are all putting blood on their hands to prove that they were part of this. The 6 doors to the Bomer Theater open up, and in stepped actors in military outfits with automatic weapons, and you hear them go click, click, like they set their things to start firing. Suddenly, we were all in Santiago, Chile, because less than a decade previously, the Chilean Revolution that overthrew Salvador Allende and installed Pinochet resulted in 4,000 executions, 40,000 prisoners were kept in the National Stadium for up to 2 years and tortured there. Several 100,000 people went into exile. During the 1980s, this was one of the most huge, political events at that time, and Jerry Turner gave us a feeling of what that was like. And then the soldiers disappeared, the actors disappeared, the doors opened, the lights came up, we all went down and had our wine and our coffee, whatever we could have. Well, my brother-in-law, who was a colonel in the Air Force, was utterly silent. He was very disturbed. He said nothing for the rest of the day and the evening. The next morning he got up and told me that was the most fantastic Shakespeare play he ever saw. It had a powerful impact on a military man. And so this was anybody who saw that play remembers it vividly, remembers that chilling feeling of now we too are caught in this drama. It was incredible. So Hamlet, done 10 years ago as a modern security state. Ophelia's wearing a wire. And there's security cameras around, spying on everybody. So they did it in that theme. And then they did, a Middle East war theme for Troilus and Cressida, which of course on the Troy in modern day Turkey was somewhat in the Middle East there. They did a similar theme with Coriolanus and portrayed it also as a Middle Eastern war during the time of the height of the Iraq War. So these were ways that Oregon Shakespeare Festival has implemented and used contemporary political and military situations to be represented on their stage to give commentaries on, where is the moral value in these enterprises. Most recently, it was a production of Timon of Athens on Broadway just last year with a female Timon as a 1%er party girl, throwing a vast banquet for all her friends. And then, of course, everything goes south for Timon. Runs out of money, ends up in the wilderness. And the final scene of the play, which is not in Shakespeare's text at all, is a Pietà-like image at the very end of the play. Normally, like in the Greek drama, the death occurs off stage and there's no visioning of the dead body. Timon dies mysteriously. in the Greek manner. That's appropriate. But this Broadway production emphasized how bereft Timon was and how terrible all the people were who had turned against Timon in his time of need. So you can see how these things have occurred in modern theater. Now I bring up this image of Mark Rylance in his wonderful production of Richard III. He and the company from the Globe Theatre was an all-male company. They ran this in the Globe Theatre in London, then they put it out at the Apollo Theatre, and then they came to Broadway with Richard III and Twelfth Night. He won the Tony Award for Best Supporting Actor for the Twelfth Night on that occasion. But I got to see him when I was in London in 2012 performing as Richard III, and you had a real good feeling for how terrible a person this Richard is, and how mean and how awful and immoral he was. And of course, some of the things that Richard does resonated with Stephen Greenblatt on the eve of the 2016 election. He wrote some comments in a letter to the editor, and then he expanded that into this book, Tyrant. And I want to show you a few quotes from his book, Tyrant, that reference Richard III. Well, he says here that the word politician in Shakespeare was virtually synonymous with hypocrite. I'm not so sure about that, but that's his opinion on that. But he said, Richard III promises to make England great again. The absurdity of the demagogue's rhetoric was blatantly obvious. These are all quotes from Greenblatt's book. Sexual conquest excites him, but only for the endlessly reiterated proof that he can have it all. I think he's reading into the text a little bit, but the seduction of Anne after, Richard catches up with her, the corpse of her husband, suggests there were some parallels there, certainly. And these last comments, I think, are particularly relevant. He talks about fake news, that Richard will issue drunken prophecies, libels, and talk about dreams, a steady barrage of falsehoods, and to sow confusion. And these are all quotes directly from Shakespeare that Greenblatt uses in his book, Tyrant. He also talks about Coriolanus and King Lear and other characters, but he really focuses on Richard III as exemplar of a true tyrant. Then, of course, in the campaign to become king, Richard obviously shows fraudulent display of religious piety. You can just think about holding up the Bible. The slandering of opponents and an exaggerated threat to national security. Finally, he says this, that we are charmed again and again by the villain's outrageousness, by his indifference to the ordinary norms of human decency, by lies that seem affected even though no one believes them. In other words, he's bizarre and yet he's charismatic. And it's that combination that is so compelling to some followers of an authoritarian type consciousness. So these are some of the things that have been happening in very recent years. Let's go back 50, 75 years to the mid-portion of the 20th century, because there again, we see some evidence of these kinds of things happening. Now, Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, 1982, what a wonderful cast. Paul Scofield, Ian Holm, Derek Jacobi, Judi Dench. He had a fabulous cast, and he got nominated for Academy Award for Best Actor and Best Director. It was his first directorial debut. So Henry V is a good platform if you're going to show a great, probably the most popular Shakespeare play ever produced. It made more money than any other Shakespeare play in film. Now, Stephen Marks, commenting in 1992, some years after that, says that in Henry V, Shakespeare aims the full blast of his rhetorical power at the audience. The choruses inflame us to collaborate with the author in producing a spectacle to sweep away thought in a flood of patriotic passion. Okay, flood of patriotic passion. All right, Henry. This is what John Julius Norwich, whose wonderful book Shakespeare's Kings. I highly recommend this book. It's an excellent look at the history of Shakespeare's kings and compare them to the actual characters in their lives. Henry V, though by no means the greatest of Shakespeare's histories, is the only one that ranks as a true epic. A patriotic paean celebrating England's only royal hero, the triumphant conclusion of a 9-part work that had taken the author the first decade of his active life. Now, this is another image of Sir Laurence Olivier as Henry V. This is a 1944 production of Henry V, the first film in Technicolor to come out of England at that time. There was one Technicolor camera in all of England. Guess who wanted him to do this? Winston Churchill. Guess why it was being done? Because it was to build up the English identity and cohesiveness and the thrust back into Europe in 1944 on D-Day, the day I was born, actually, 1944. So here's beautiful Laurence Olivier starring in this. Now, who was behind this? Well, it was Winston Churchill, who instructed Olivier to fashion the film, which was filmed in Ireland, which was a neutral party during World War II, boosting the propaganda for British troops invading, and its release in London corresponded with the D-Day invasion. Okay? And it ran for a full year in London theaters. It was the most popular film at that time in production. And it won Olivier several Academy Awards, for an honorary Academy Award as being the director and producer and lead actor in this show. It won him, a special honor. But it was released to coincide exactly with the invasion of Normandy, with the British troops invading France again. Now, it's partly funded by the British government, and it was dedicated to those who had fought for England in past battles. Now, here's the director's cut. It's very interesting what he did. He intentionally left out many of Henry's harsher scenes. There was no beheading of the Southampton plotters. There's no threat to unleash his troops to rape and pillage Harfleur if the city refused to surrender. He's got to be nice to the French, because actually they're their allies at this point. There's no cutting the throats of the French prisoners during the Battle of Agincourt. And there's no refusal to stop the hanging of his old friend Bardolph for looting. In other words, he kind of cleaned it up. He whitewashed this so that there was no anti-French sentiment. It was simply Henry being big. And of course, the final scene shows some reconciliation between the French and the English, which is, suitable for that situation. But it was done as a wartime propaganda film. Now, what about across the English Channel? I thanked Wally Hurst for these next few slides that I'm going to show you, because England was not alone in their love of Shakespeare at that time. Germany was equally invested in Shakespeare of that time. And these are some slides and quotes from Wally's wonderful slideshow. His presentation is available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship conference videos from, I believe, 2017 that he presented that. So I would advise you to go look at that if you're more interested in this topic. But these are just some selected slides from him, from German scholars who were commenting on the importance of Shakespeare to the German nation, the German people, the German identity. There is no nation, not even the English nation, that can lay a better claim to Shakespeare than the German nation. Shakespeare's characters are part of our world. His soul has merged with ours. And though he was born and buried in England, Germany is the country where he truly lives. And that's from Gerhard Hauptmann, a Nobel Prize laureate, writing in 1915 during World War I. Okay? Another World War I scholar, Ludwig Fulda, says this: and if we succeed in defeating England, then I think we should insert a clause in the peace treaty that William Shakespeare has to be formally transferred to Germany. I even believe the English would be rather prepared to consent to this transfer, because they do not know how to deal with him properly anyway. A little arrogance there, I'd say. No doubt, William Roth, another very famous German intellectual of that period in the pre-World War II era, says, there is no other instance on record where the mental and artistic exponent of a whole epic, Shakespeare, was so absolutely become amalgamated with the neighboring nation, kindred in race and character, to be sure, yet actually separated by language and totally different political development, Germany. Well, what about der Führer? Well, this is a quote from Goebbels' private diary that is fascinating. Here's what Goebbels has to say. Hitler also owned the collected works of William Shakespeare, published in German translation in 1925 by George Müller as part of a series intended to make great literature available to the general public. The entire set is bound in hand-tooled Moroccan leather with a gold-embossed eagle flanked with his initials on the spine. He considered Shakespeare superior to Goethe and Schiller in every respect. Why was it, he wondered, the German Enlightenment produced Nathan the Wise, the story of a rabbi who reconciles Christians, Muslims, and Jews, while it had been left to Shakespeare to give us the world of the Merchant of Venice and Shylock. Okay? So, depending on which side of the channel on, Shakespeare seemed to have some profound influence on the identity of both the English and the German nations. And we have many wonderful German scholars who are interested in the Shakespeare authorship question. Hannah Wember out there, yes, and most recently deceased, our dear friend Robert de Tobel. Several German scholars. There are others who are also doing research on the Shakespeare authorship question. So Germany is also interested in this particular question. What about the other fascist nations during that same period? Well, here's an image of Mussolini superimposed on Julius Caesar. Mussolini wrote an adaptation of Julius Caesar and had it performed before 35,000 people in a square in Rome. Obviously, he identified himself with Julius Caesar and thought that this was a fabulous play that inspired him to actually write a whole new script that adapted the tragedy of Julius Caesar. Well, what about the Japanese fascist? Well, here's the Japanese foreign minister playing Hamlet in 1932. So obviously we have Kurosawa's adaptation, The Throne of Blood, adaptation of Macbeth. He was fascinated by Shakespeare, no doubt. And finally, a professor of English in Japan during World War II says this: down with the Yanks, down with the Brits, they are our enemies. See Shakespeare, he is ours as well. So clearly Shakespeare had some influence in both the Allied side and on the fascist side during World War II era. So just to make that fit. Now we're going to jump back to the 16th century, a little time warp. Okay, so we're shifting gears right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Shakespeare and Politics contemporary to his time. John Dover Wilson, in the Essential Shakespeare writing almost 100 years ago, says, Elizabethan drama was a social institution that performed many functions. Among other things, it's like a modern newspaper. In a word, it was topical. That word topical, you won't find many Shakespeare scholars mentioning the word topical. Shakespeare wasn't topical. Shakespeare was universal. Shakespeare was eternal. He's not referencing any activities or political situations or whatever personally that are going on during this time. We're going to challenge that in talking about Hamlet and A Midsummer Night's Dream toward the end of this discussion. What was going on in England during that time? Well, there was a cultural revolution of an extraordinary nature. We think of the digital revolution in our time as being extraordinary and having transformed people's lives. Think of what happened in England during the late 16th century. Between 1575 and 1580, 7 huge playhouses were constructed in London. Can you imagine that? 7 gone up in a town of 200,000 people. So that's pretty remarkable, isn't it? I mean, suddenly you got this flowering, this burst of energy. The classical Greeks had something similar to this go on. The productivity during the Golden Age of Athens, which was a very narrow period of time, about 50 years, it was mirrored again in the English period of time during this highly creative time of the last quarter of the 15th century, 16th century, and the first years of the 17th century. During the 1590s, more than 500 different plays were staged in England. Now, we only have, a fraction of that number extant, but we have documentary evidence that there were that many plays that were in production with different companies, and there were 30 different men's and boys' companies operating throughout England during that time. Many of them focused on London, but also some traveling troops. The Lord Admiral's men put on 35 plays per year during that time. Now, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival puts on 11 plays a year. We think that's fantastic. But 35 plays a year. So it was a massive cultural revolution going on. I think people really appreciate what a huge influence it had and how widely it was accepted as a mode by which people related to each other. The 1 penny admission, of course, guaranteed that you would get the groundlings in there, and you pay 2 pennies, you get into the gallery, and if you really have some bucks, you can actually sit on the stage. So, but more than 20,000 people every week. So 10% of the population of London saw a play every week. So, do the arithmetic. Everybody sees about 10 plays a year at least. So very popular. Andrew Gurr, long quote here. Sorry, this is a very wordy presentation. We'll get through this. It was the only major medium for social intercommunication, other than hangings and going to church, of course. He says the fictions of the stage were certainly not so marginal to the affairs of state because imaginative thought had few other outlets and none with the cohesiveness or coerciveness, of the minds of the men in company. Peter Lake, in his book on how Shakespeare put politics back on the stage, says, and this is an important quote, in an emergently absolutist personal monarchy, so this is Elizabethan era, Greenblatt calls this as bad as North Korea is today in terms of the control of the media and what got published and what you could get away with. During that absolutist personal monarchy and during a period in which issues of succession and legitimacy were much on people's minds, the plays were consistently about kings and queens, were quintessentially political plays. And here's his final and really most important point, and it really points to the work of Ramon Jimenez in his book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, because he talks about the productions put on by the Queensmen in the 1580s. The Queensmen and the apocryphal Shakespeare, we're talking about the famous victories of Henry V, the true tragedy of Richard III, King John, King Lear. In the inventing of the English history play is the chapter he takes us from. There is no question that these plays represent a campaign to give legitimacy to a Protestant drive for substantial truth, and that the Queensmen provided the regime with the ideal means to bring the theater back into the service of a Protestant ideology which could be identified with the truth of Tudor history. Now, where did Tudor history come from? Well, Lily Campbell agrees with him that each of Shakespeare's histories serves as a special purpose in elucidating a political problem of Elizabethan's day and the bringing to bear upon the problem accepted political philosophy of the Tudors. So we're saying that this is supportive of the Tudor regime, of Elizabeth's claim to the throne, of her legitimacy. And of course, the primary sources for the history plays are Hall's Chronicles and Holinshed's Chronicle. So Tilliard interprets these things as saying it's a repository of political dogma supporting the divine election of the Tudors. So, you know, the Ricardian Society, of course, has fought this idea that Richard III was such a terrible person, but he was assassinated by Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. So that establishes her legitimacy because Richard was such a terrible person, but that's only because Holinshed and Hall's kind of painted it that way. So they demonized Richard III. Well, let's talk a little bit about censorship and subversive and satiric Shakespeare. And I'm going to kind of race through a lot of stuff here. I do recommend you take a look at the article that's in the syllabus on my article on the Midsummer Night's Dream as an Aristophanic political satire. I think that'll give you a lot of the information I'm going to be presenting to you over the next 15 minutes here as we proceed through a bunch of stories about both Hamlet and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, if you were a playwright in London during that time, you were a little bit at risk of being imprisoned and tortured. Of course, Marlowe was interviewed by the Star Chamber, accused of atheism, and if you think the documents are valid, he was assassinated in 1593. There are some Marlovians who believe that it was a cover-up and that he somehow shipped off to the continent and wrote the works of Shakespeare from someplace in Europe. Thomas Kidd, who was Marlowe's roommate, was arrested, tortured in Bridewell Prison, and died just a year later, perhaps as a consequence of the various things that had happened while he was tortured during Bridewell Prison. Thomas Nash was imprisoned on several occasions for writing Christ Cheers Over Jerusalem and also was co-authoring The Isle of Dogs. His books were burned publicly. Ben Jonson was imprisoned for The Isle of Dogs at Eastward Ho along with George Chapman. But was Shakespeare ever arrested? No. Was he ever interrogated? No. Was he ever called forward because of things he had written? No. Now, this is a scene, the deposition scene from Richard II, produced by the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. That's Jeffrey King on the right there as you know, claiming the throne. Henry Bolingbroke. Look how fierce he looks. I mean, that's an impressive view. Well, this was a very, very subversive scene. The deposition of a royally anointed king is not something you take lightly. After all, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots caused Spain finally to declare war and send the Armada in 1588. So you don't assassinate an anointed king or queen without consequences. But somehow Shakespeare got away with this. First of all, the Earl of Essex paid his followers, provided for a command performance. They paid double to have the Lord Chamberlain's men put on a production of Richard II in 1601 on the eve of the rebellion. Now, it might have been a setup that Robert Cecil had invoked. We're not sure about that. The history on that is not completely clear. But it's interesting that the Earl of Essex was actually interested in Richard II 4 years previously, according to commentaries by Sir Walter Raleigh. He said the conceit of Richard II hath made the Earl of Essex wonderful merry. So, for whatever reason, Essex thought that this represented something that he believed in. So the deposition could not be included in the published quartos. And Queen Elizabeth says in an interview in the months after the execution of Essex that she says, "Know you not that I am Richard?" That she was identified as the target of Essex rebellion in that time, that he was attempting to depose her at that time. It was Augustine Phillips, who was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's company, who was questioned. But no arrests were made, and they continued to make plays at court. In fact, on the eve of Essex execution, the Lord Chamberlain's men produced a play at court that very evening. Now we're going to move on to Hamlet. This is Mel Gibson and Zeffirelli's adaptation of Hamlet, a very fine production, I thought. Other people perhaps had some objections to this. But the tragedy of Hamlet, according to Heron Goddard, whose wonderful collection, The Meaning of Shakespeare, I think really points to an Oxfordian source. To nearly everyone, both Hamlet himself and the play give the impression of having some particularly intimate relationship to their creator. Hamlet is the most bewildering, most fascinating of all his plays, largely autobiographical. This is Shakespeare. himself. No, there isn't an Oxfordian here who would disagree with that. And this is an image from Kenneth Branagh's production of Hamlet as he's mocking the appearance of old men. He references the satiric slave, and he's insulting Polonius here for being an older man and lacking wit and having weak legs and all this. And he's actually quoting from the satire by the Roman satirist Juvenal, his 10th satires. It's very interesting that Juvenal was not recognized as the author of the satires that he wrote for 250 years. So Juvenal hid his identity because writing those satires was politically dangerous during the time that he was actually writing these things that were critical of the Roman emperors. So there's a long history of Juvenal actually avoiding, identification as the author of these really very clever satires. And if you're interested in this, I would recommend his 10th satire because it does parallel in many ways what Hamlet is telling Polonius in this case. Well, Laurence Olivier, again, paralleling Branagh and Olivier, had a very famous scene, a very famous production of Hamlet in 1948. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The production won Best Movie. It was the first foreign film ever to win the Academy Award. It was renowned. Now, it was started as the man who couldn't make up his mind. Was Olivier's approach, and he showed him as a blonde, sort of Teutonic person who was very much attached to his mother, kind of a Freudian interpretation. But here he is, having assassinated Polonius inadvertently, behind the dais there. So what about Polonius and Hamlet? Well, Lord Burghley was clearly identified by scholars going back 150 years ago as the model for Polonius. Burghley was Elizabeth's primary advisor for the 45 years that she was in power. Her number one, he was a treasurer, her first secretary, her spy master. He was her man, in more ways than you could imagine. Burghley was also the Earl of Oxford's guardian from the time he was 12 until he was 21. For 9 years, he lived in Cecil House on the Strand as a ward of the court under Burghley's tutelage. He married Burghley's daughter, Anne Cecil, so he was very connected and had reasons to, know what Cecil was like. Well, what are the identifying features that connect Cecil and Polonius? Now, in the first quarto of Hamlet, of which we only have one copy, actually, the Polonius character is named Corambis. The translation of that Latin expression would be double heart or split heart. Okay, Burghley's motto was cor unum via unum, one heart, one way. So naming the character Corambis, a little bit pointing in that direction. Okay, and then there are the certain precepts, which of course were published posthumously, and long after Shakespeare had, whoever wrote Hamlet, had written Hamlet, which were apparently the sources for the precepts that Polonius lays on Laertes before he heads off to university in Paris. Well, during that time, in the play, Reynaldo was sent to spy on Laertes, just like William Cecil sent spies to spy on his older son, Thomas Cecil. So we have that parallel. And of course, Anne Cecil would be in the place of Ophelia, the somewhat abused daughter. Hamlet accuses Polonius as being a fishmonger. Cecil tried to get Parliament to pass a law that would force people to eat fish twice a week if they lived within 15 miles of the ocean or the channel. So, he was referring to him as a fishmonger. And that's been a recognized connection for about 150 years. But today, you won't get Stephen Greenblatt or James Shapiro or Jonathan Bate to suggest that. No. That association means nothing. The number of tags and identifiers are, I think, hard to resist. Mark Alexander has written very commendably about this, and his website is identified there. Source textbook, go look for that Polonius article that shows all those parallels. And I want to quote one passage from Cecil's precepts. And this is one that makes me want to mock him. It has to do with the choice of a wife. Use great providence and circumspection in the choice of thy wife. Do not be too poor, neither choose a base and uncomely creature altogether for wealth, for it will cause contempt in others and loathing in thee. Make not choice of a dwarf or a fool, for from the one thou mayest beget a race of pygmies, and the other may thy daily disgrace, for it will irk thee to have her talk. You can imagine having to sit through dinners and listen to this kind of talk, and you would want to mock it later in a play that identifies this character. So anyway, what about Queen Elizabeth? And we're coming down the last 20 minutes here of my presentation. I'm going to really drill down a little bit on A Midsummer Night's Dream and Queen Elizabeth as being represented as Queen Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream. My article on this, I think, is easily available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. The link is there in your syllabus. Helen Hackett, in her wonderful book, Shakespeare and Elizabeth, The Meeting of Two Myths, has this to say. The clearest reference to Queen Elizabeth in Shakespeare's works is arguably Oberon's vision in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the subject of more voluminous speculation than any other 25 lines in all of Shakespeare. And these are some of those lines. It refers to the fair vestal throned by the west. Clearly, Elizabeth. She's in the west. She's throned. She's the vestal virgin. Okay? Cupid, all armed, a certain aim he took at a fair vestal, loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow, as it should pierce 100,000 hearts. But I might see Cupid's fiery shaft quenched, and the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votaress passed on in maiden meditation fancy free. So the arrow misses, lands on that purple flower. Okay, the watery moon, the imperial votaress, those are other identifiers associated with Queen Elizabeth. Well, what about this thing where Titania is madly in love with a monster, with an ass-headed bottom, okay? Well, Jonathan Bate has this to say about that in his really fine book, otherwise, in Shakespeare and Ovid, 1993. Shakespeare cannot afford to license the interpretation of this as an image of the queen in a perverse encounter which upsets both the natural and social order. If such an interpretation were at all prominent, the master of the revels would not have licensed the play, okay? So he says, no, you cannot do that. And yet other scholars writing in the Shakespeare Quarterly somewhat earlier, John Allen says, Queen Elizabeth, as the emblem of sovereignty, is the political equivalent of Titania, the emblem of nature's sway over living things. And of course, Titania's fight with Oberon is what causes these floods, the crop failures, and all the things that are going wrong in England that are described in the early scenes of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, here's the one line within the play that I think clearly points to a topical allusion that connects Elizabeth with Titania. Titania says this, after her first encounter with Bottom under the influence of the love potion, she's about to take him off. She's going off to her bower, and they're going to go to bed together, or whatever it is. She says, the moon, methinks, looks with a watery eye, and when she weeps, weeps every little flower, lamenting some enforced chastity. Okay? What does that really mean? What does that really mean? Well, Elizabeth, of course, is associated with the moon, the goddess Diana. She's named Titania in the Latin version of Ovid's Metamorphoses, one of Shakespeare's most enriched sources, and certainly the source for the story of Pyramus and Thisbe that they make a mockery of in the Rude Mechanicals. Little shtick at the very end of the play. Elizabeth's women of the chamber were bribed by Christopher Hatton to wail all night long and keep the queen awake the night that she announced her engagement to the Duke of Alençon in 1581. She was with her minister. She was angry at them. She said, I'll marry him. And they exchanged rings right there, in front of Earl of Leicester, who was horrified, William Cecil, who was shocked by this sudden move. That night, Hatton paid the women of the bedchamber to cry all night, not let the queen sleep. And in the morning, she returned the ring to Alençon, the Duke, and said, I'm sorry, we got to call it off. My ministers, my people, they will not tolerate me marrying a Catholic. I'm sorry, we can't go forward with this. This one image within the play suggests Elizabeth's identification with Titania. It's enough for me. But we have much more to go with the Duke of Alençon. Now, Duke of Alençon was known as Monsieur. He was the youngest brother of Catherine de' Medici. His older brother was King Henry III of France. He was the next in line. Henry III had no children. Henry IV was the former Henry Navarre, from Navarre. So the Duke of Alençon stood in line to become King of France eventually. His birth name was Hercule de Valois, but he was small. He was not a Hercules character, Hercule, the French pronunciation of Hercules. And later at his christening, he was named after his elder brother who had died, King Francois. So he was actually called Francois Hercule de Valois. So Francois and Hercule are the two names that are associated at this first name, but he was referred to as Monsieur. This is an image from the Valois tapestries that Catherine de' Medici may have financed. William of Orange also may have been involved in creating these wonderful Dutch tapestries that show the regal nature of the Duke of Alençon and other members of the Medici family. Here's an image from the Dutch painter contemporary with that. It shows Queen Elizabeth and William of Orange standing at the front of the cow. Queen Philip of Spain is sitting on top of the cow, which is the emblem of the Low Countries, of the Netherlands at the time. And there's the Duke of Alençon at the very back, holding onto the tail. And if you look carefully at his left leg, you will see a certain excrement is being distributed upon him by the Dutch. He was sent as Elizabeth's proxy to fight the Spanish in the Low Countries and became invested as the Duke of Brabant, referred to in Love's Labour's Lost. But he was an unsuccessful military commander. And after a year in Holland, he was run out. He tried to bring on the French army into Antwerp. The citizens of Antwerp turned them away. There was mass killings of the French troops. Alençon withdrew to France, and at the age of 29, he died of a broken heart, basically. But his story and his relationship with Elizabeth is critical to our understanding about Bottom and Titania. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So Alençon was first offered in marriage to Elizabeth in 1573 when he was like 15 years old. He was like 18 years younger than Elizabeth. She was in her mid-40s, and he was in his mid-20s by the time they finally got together. He wrote Elizabeth many love letters during that last few years of their courtship. He secretly snuck into England twice to visit her without passports, without the permission of the King of France. Elizabeth daily would visit his chambers improperly chaperoned. So she was alone with him in his bedchamber from time to time during the times that he would sneak into England. And according to Martin Hume, whose wonderful book I highly recommend, The Courtships of Queen Elizabeth and Her Suitors after her marriage. It's easily available. You can get a reprint edition for $15. It's fabulous commentaries on the courtships of Queen Elizabeth, and particularly the Alençon affair. All these things are really pointing in this direction. The Queen's passion and vanity were overmastering her judgment. Leicester and Walsingham and Philip Sidney, they were all opposed to the Alençon match, whereas the Earl of Sussex and William Cecil, and presumably the Earl of Oxford, were in favor of the Alençon match. They were basically triangulating. She was never going to marry him. She was trying to keep the French from having an alliance with the Spanish, and they would have a unified force against England at that time. In 1579, Alençon sent his ambassador, Jean Simier, to negotiate terms of the marriage treaty. At one time, there were 400 ambassadors in 1581 that came over for these negotiations. It was a huge deal. Simier was the most choice courtier, exquisitely skilled in love toys, pleasant conceits, court dalliances. Elizabeth called him her ape, Simier, ape. He was accused by the Earl of Leicester of using love potions, and Leicester tried to have him assassinated twice, unsuccessfully. Simier outed Leicester for his marriage to Lettice Knollys, which then resulted in Leicester's being put in house arrest. So he was critical right in the middle of this whole, melodrama going on. It was like a soap opera in the court of England. Queen Elizabeth, she had become, this is what Hume says, she had become more beautiful and bonny than she was 15 years ago. So she had these two little Frenchmen sneaking in and out of England, giving her love potions, and she was visiting them unchaperoned in their bedchambers. I think we have a story here that's worth doing. Alençon, known as Monsieur, when he finally left at the end of the negotiations, when it was obvious that Elizabeth would not marry a Catholic, she wrote this very ambivalent poem on Monsieur's departure. I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I do, yet dare not say I ever meant. I seem stark mute, but inwardly do prate. I am and not, I freeze and yet I burn. So far, so ambivalent, goes on and on and on. You can go on Monsieur's departure, you can just Google that, and you see this most incredible ambivalent thing. And she received love letters from Simier also, which only recently were decoded. They were sent in a cipher of some type. So these guys were really having some fun behind the dais in the Queen's bedroom. Now, on his death in 1584, Elizabeth grieved publicly for 3 weeks. She wore black for 6 months and referred to herself as a widow. That's how close he came to marrying her. Then at the age of 29, this is what Martin says, this is it. His passing bell rang down the curtain upon the longest and most eventful comedy in the history of England. Now, do you think Shakespeare, if he knew about this, if he was on the inside of this, would have 10 years later taken the risk of writing a play about this? I think so. This is what the Earl of Oxford had to put up. Now, during this time, the Earl of Oxford was in exile from court. This was after he had impregnated Anne Vavasard and had an illegitimate child and was banished from court for several years. All this was going on some of the time while he was no longer available in court. Stephen Budiansky, a modern historian writing about Francis Walsingham, says this: their courtship became simply a farce, a bit of political theater that dragged on 3 scenes too long, a joke even to the queen, as she admitted in moments of privacy and candor. Now I want to tie, in the last 15 minutes of my talk here, how Bottom and Alençon are tied together. Well, at the beginning of the play, when the lewd mechanicals are getting cast in the roles, Bottom says, I could play Heracles rarely, or part to tear a cat in to make all split. So he claims that he could play Hercules. Well, Hercule de Valois, okay? There's the name. Bottom repeatedly addresses each of the fairies as Monsieur, which was his appellation, Alençon's appellation. Bottom repeatedly asks for the honey bag, Now, asses don't eat honey. Why does he want a honey bag? Maybe that's a little thing about money bag. Because Alençon received huge support from Elizabeth for the campaign in the Low Countries, 350,000 pounds altogether. Oxfordians are impressed with the fact that the Earl got 1,000 pounds a year for 18 years. Alençon's contributions dwarf that substantially. Now, there's one more thing about the face and the beard that Alençon. Now, he had pockmarks because he had smallpox, and so did Elizabeth, actually. So there may have been some connection because they both had survived smallpox. Bottom says, he's talking about how he'll play his role as Pyramus. I will discharge it in either your straw-colored beard, your orange and tawny beard, your purple and grain beard, or your French crown-colored beard, your perfect yellow. Quint says, some of your French crowns have no hair at all, and then you play them barefaced. Well, this is a loaded discourse between these two. French crown actually is a joke alluding to the loss of hair that you get when you have secondary and tertiary syphilis, the French pox. It's also called the French pox. So it's a pun on French royalty, French crown, French money, and the baldness from syphilis. Now, Alençon was slanderously rumored to have gone bald from syphilis in the Gaping Gulf pamphlet that cost John Stubbs his right hand. Alençon's beard was discussed in state papers as well. There's a satiric comment when Francis Flute, Francis, another character in the Brood Mechanicals that has Alençon's name. Pyramus is a sweet-faced man, is what Quince tells Francis Flute, who doesn't want to play a girl. He says, but the talk of Elizabeth's marriage to Alençon was drawn out with 1,000 banalities as to the possibility of secret meetings between the lovers, than the depth and number of pock holes in the suitor's face from the scarring from the smallpox. Finally, the last allusion I'm going to kind of tag into you with is this one. This is the most potent one of all. When Oberon's talking about what he's going to do with the love potion, he says, I'll watch Titania when she is asleep and drop the liquor into her eyes. The next thing, then she is waking, looks upon, be it a lion, bear, or wolf, or bull, on meddling monkey or on busy ape. He's doubling down on that simian imagery. She shall pursue it with the soul of love. Well, the meddling monkey and the busy ape could be allusion to the simie, her ape, okay? And the meddling monkey could be Alençon because his brother, Henry V, referred to him as le petit magot, the little monkey. So both of these French suitors were known as monkeys. So that's probably where that double image of the meddling monkey or the busy ape comes from. So that we have lots of associations. So what are the associations of the cast? What is our allegorical cast? Queen Elizabeth as Titania, Hercule Valois is represented by Bottom and Pyramus, Francois, the same person as Francis Flute and Thisbe, Ambassador de Canzey, who came early in the negotiation as Peter Quince, same route. Dubex was Alençon's secretary who came with him on both occasions. Bex meaning beak, snout, okay? The Earl of Leicester was Elizabeth's Robin. Perhaps he represents Robin Starveling, who has to play Moonshine in the allegory of Pyramus and Thisbe. And Ambassador Mo de Fenelon, who was also part of the negotiating team as the fairy moth, or Mo. Roger Strittmaner's article in the Oxfordian in 2006 is what really set me onto this case. He says this, and I'm just going to quickly go through this. Topical evidence suggests that an author whose preoccupations included a closely veiled comic commentary on one of the most explosive issues of the reign, the intersection of the private life and courtships of Elizabeth I and the matters of public policy and authority. So often do the Queen, her courtship, and the matter of succession appear in the critical literature of A Midsummer Night's Dream that it is difficult to avoid concluding that the play constitutes, on one level, a sly commentary on the sexual politics of the Elizabethan era. And I think the case is made for that. Bottom, Thou Art Translated is a 1974 book published in Amsterdam, of all places, by Marion Taylor. It's in your syllabus. If you can get a hold of that, this tells you the whole story. Not only was Shakespeare writing about this, but so were Spenser and Sidney and other writers. Mother Hubbard's Tale by Spenser is all about Simier and Alençon. It's a wonderful discourse. Bottom, Thou Art Translated. Finally, the Earl of Oxford did have a connection to the Duke of Alençon. He did meet him in court during the coronation of King Henry III. And he was urged by Henry Howard, his cousin, to run to Alençon and beg him for mercy at the time that Anne Vavasor's pregnancy was revealed and she delivered a baby, and she was the maid of honor that had the had Oxford's bastard son, Edward Vere. So they had some connection. And it's funny that you mentioned, that you think about this, because the Earl of Oxford refused twice to dance before the 400 French ambassadors that came over in 1581 for the negotiations. And it's very interesting that Theseus says, we won't have any dancing when Bottom offers to do a Burgamask task at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream. So Theseus, no, we won't have no dancing. And Oxford says, no, we'll have no dancing for those French ambassadors. So maybe there's a small connection there. But I want to talk finally in the last 5-10 minutes of this talk about the politics of the Shakespeare authorship question itself. Okay? Now, we have many doubters that go back centuries, really. But really, some of the best writers and critics of our 20th century really have a lot to say about this. Now, Walt Whitman, he had some concept of this. Shakespeare was probably one of those wolfish earls. I love that quote. But Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead is a fantastic. You can get that on Google. But I highly recommend you go to the YouTube video of Keir Cutler's Is Shakespeare Dead. He performed this last year at our conference in Hartford, Connecticut, at the Mark Twain House. So here he was performing a Mark Twain adaptation of Mark Twain's satire. It was fabulous. You will very much enjoy that. Mark Twain had his finger on the pulse of this, and of course his editors and the people who are publishing his collected works today want to disown that Is Shakespeare Dead chapter from his autobiography. But I think we've pressed them hard on this one, and hopefully it will be included in the future of his writings. Henry James, turn of the century, says, I am haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on the patient world. And I only use one modern actor to quote him. Now, of course, we've got Derek Jacobi, Mark Rylance, Jeremy Irons, many others, Keanu Reeves today, have all come down on the side that there's a problem here, and there's probably somebody else wrote these works. So we have Robin Williams saying, you think a man basically with a second-grade education wrote some of the greatest works of all times? I think not. Oh, what a crazy, wonderful, witty guy he was, but he understood that there was a problem here. But when you turn to those serious writers and serious scholars who want to comment on the whole question of the Shakespeare authorship question, you incur such hyperbole and such distempered responses that it's shocking. Hilary Mantel, the author of Wolf Hall, made famous Mark Rylance in the series that was performed a few years ago. Says this, that the authorship question is a tale of snobbery and ignorance, of unhistorical assumptions, of myths about the writing life. Oh my goodness, she hasn't done the reading. Terry Teachout, Wall Street Journal theater editor and reviewer, says that we're zanies whose theory mongering has blighted the world of Shakespeare studies. Have we really blighted the world of Shakespeare studies? I think not. Peter Conrad, a theater reviewer for The Guardian, says Oxfordians are cranks, a reprehensible, reactionary lot, and I apologize if what I've been presenting is reprehensible or reactionary in any way. I think I'm responding actually to the historical and the literary evidence that we have at hand. Finally, the final insult comes from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. In response to the film Anonymous, the Birthplace Trust put together a little online book called Shakespeare Bites Back. It's still available online, and here's a quote from it that is particularly stinging, and it's hyperbole. Dare to suggest that snobbery is a hidden agenda of the anti-Shakespearean movement, and you stand the risk of having your head bitten off or being made to feel you have caused offense. The Shakespeare authorship conspiracy theory is an entirely parasitic phenomenon, attacking the truth in order to feed off its lifeblood. Like all conspiracy theories, it has no independent, self-determining life of its own, and instead attaches itself leech-like to a healthy body. And that's from the Reverend Dr. Paul Edmondson, the Director of Research and Knowledge at the Birthplace Trust, and Professor Emeritus Stanley Wells, writing just 6 years ago. Their tune hasn't changed. I think they protest too much. And I have this slide to reassure you that even though we've talked about Bottom and Titania in this way, don't worry, girl, you're better off without those asses, okay? Stick to the reading. Conclusions from my talk here today. Great presidents have been inspired by Shakespeare. Shakespeare's political dramas have been weaponized from the 16th to the 21st century. Elizabethan drama grew rapidly as a cultural phenomenon, promoting the legitimacy of the Tudors. 16th century playwrights were often censored and imprisoned, except Shakespeare, that he enjoyed unique poetic license in satirizing members of the court, including Queen Elizabeth, and that the Shakespeare authorship challenge over the past century has become the third rail of Shakespeare and possibly even Renaissance studies. So those are my conclusions. I urge you to continue to read. Use your own judgment. Be critical. Don't listen to the likes of Terry Teachout and Hilary Mantel when they haven't done the reading. Talk to people who have done the reading. Go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. Go look at the videos that have been recorded from our previous conferences and choose some that may be of some interest to you. I think you need to become an independent scholar. Stephen Sable has referred to me as a scholar. I'm no scholar. I'm a motivated investigative reporter. That's what I am for you, friends.